So let's take a closer look at the cell's plasma membrane or cell membrane. So the functions of the plasma membrane is to separate the cell from its environment. So if we take a look at this picture over here on the bottom left, here's the plasma membrane or cell membrane surrounding the cell here. And you can see how it's going to separate what's inside the cell from whatever is outside the cell, whatever is outside here in its environment. So that is one function of the plasma membrane. And then the other function of the plasma membrane is it's going to control the transport of the molecules into and out of the cell. So if we've got the outside of the cell up here on the top and the inside of the cell down here on the bottom, molecules that want to go in or out of the cell have to pass through the plasma membrane. So the cell can control what kind of molecules can cross through the plasma membrane. So a lot of the molecules need the help of a transport protein to cross through the membrane. And so you can see these blue proteins embedded in the membrane. They will actually help transport certain molecules in and out of the cell. And there are some molecules, though, that can actually just diffuse right through the membrane. So things like oxygen and carbon dioxide can actually just diffuse right through. But a lot of other things actually need the help of these transport proteins to go in and out of the cell because they can't just diffuse through the plasma membrane. All right, so what is our plasma membrane actually made out of? So it's made out of a phospholipid bilayer. So we can see on this bottom left picture, here is a phospholipid. And remember that the phospholipids, they have a hydrophilic head, which means it likes water, and then it has these two hydrophobic tails, which means they don't like water. And so when you put them into a watery environment, these phospholipids will huddle together and form a phospholipid bilayer. So they form two layers of phospholipids. So the hydrophilic heads that like the water will face outwards towards the water, and then the hydrophobic tails that don't like the water will huddle to the inside, and so then they can be away from the water. So this phospholipid bilayer, that's going to make up the majority of the plasma membrane. And then we do have some proteins embedded in the plasma membrane as well. That's what all these blue things are. And they will help transport things across the plasma membrane. Some of them are also involved in giving the cell its ID tag because the body needs to know what kind of cell is this? Is this a liver cell? Is it a red blood cell? What kind of cell is this? And so different proteins will help your body know what kind of cell it is. And then some of these proteins are also involved in sticking the cells together, so cell adhesion. Another component of the plasma membrane is cholesterol. So cholesterol is this kind of yellow molecule embedded within the phospholipid bilayer, and it has a really important job to maintain the correct fluidity of the plasma membrane. So it makes sure that the plasma membrane doesn't get too rigid, and it makes sure that it's not too runny either. So that's what the cholesterol does. Okay, the nucleus. So we have our nucleus found in our eukaryotic cells, and remember the nucleus is surrounded by a membrane, and the nucleus will store the DNA, so that's its function. And one DNA molecule is equal to one chromosome, and the function of the DNA or the chromosome is to store the information needed to make the proteins. So we have genes on our DNA or chromosome, and those genes will code for proteins. The other important thing to remember is that the nucleus is actually where the ribosomes are made. So that's where the ribosomes come from. So they're actually made in the nucleus, and then they will get transported out into the cytoplasm where they hang out. And remember, the ribosomes are what make the proteins. Okay, here's just a picture of a nucleus that we find in a eukaryotic cell. So you can see the membrane that surrounds the DNA that's inside. And here's kind of a close-up of part of a chromosome here, looking at the DNA there. And that is your nucleus. And then here are the ribosomes. So the ribosomes are in blue here. And we're going to talk about how they work a little bit later, but their job is to make the proteins that the genes on the DNA are encoding. So the ribosomes will make the proteins. Okay, our next thing that we find inside of our eukaryotic cells would be the endoplasmic reticulum. And a lot of times we'll just abbreviate that ER, so that's a lot easier to say. And the ER is just kind of a network of membranous tubules and sacs. And there are two different parts to the ER. We have the rough ER and the smooth ER. And the functions are to make and modify proteins. That's what the rough ER does. And then the smooth ER will make lipids. Okay, so the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or the rough ER, why is it rough? So if we take a look at our picture down here, you can see the rough ER is on top here, and you can see it's kind of bumpy. And the reason it's rough is because it has ribosomes attached to it. So that's why it's rough. So it has ribosomes attached to it. And the function of the rough ER is because it has ribosomes attached to it. Remember, the ribosomes make proteins. So the rough ER is going to make proteins and modify them. And these proteins will either be secreted to the outside of the cell, or they might be stuck into the plasma membrane. So maybe they are going to serve as transport proteins or something like that. Okay, and then our smooth ER, you can see that it's not bumpy and it's just smooth. And the reason that it's smooth is because it does not have ribosomes. And if it has no ribosomes, you know it's not making proteins. So its job is to make lipids. So it'll make things like phospholipids, maybe steroid hormones, things like that. Okay, and then our next organelle that we find in eukaryotic cells is the Golgi apparatus. So the Golgi apparatus in this picture here is this green structure. It's kind of this flattened sacs of membrane that are kind of stacked up on top of each other, and that's your Golgi apparatus. And this will have little vesicles carrying either proteins or lipids that were made by the rough or the smooth ER, and they will take those to the Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus is kind of your shipping and receiving center in the cell. So they will then take the proteins and the lipids made by the rough and the smooth ER, and they might modify them, they'll sort them, figure out where they need to go, they'll repackage them into some other vesicles, little membrane-bound sacs, and then they will tag them with a little zip code, so then the cell knows, oh, well, this needs to go to the plasma membrane, and we're going to secrete that, protein to the outside of the cell. Or maybe we're going to store this for later, and maybe we're going to do something with it another time, or maybe this goes somewhere else in the cell. Okay, and then here's just another picture of the Golgi apparatus. So you can see we've got the rough ER with the ribosomes on it, and this will be making proteins. And then here's our smooth ER over here, which has no ribosomes, so it'll be making lipids. And so you can see we've got some proteins made by the refuar, packaged up into little transport vesicles, little membrane-bound sacs. We'll take that to the Golgi apparatus, kind of our shipping, receiving center, the cell's warehouse. And the Golgi apparatus will, maybe modify the protein made by the refuar, package it up again, figure out where it needs to go, put it in this little transport vesicle, tag it with a little zip code, and this one happens to be a protein that's going to stay in the plasma membrane. So maybe it's going to be a transport protein or something.